briefly introduce my book and what it's about. It's titled Memory, Grief, and Agency, a political theological account of wrongs and rights. And the second thing I was asked to do was also to briefly introduce and maybe summarize this particular book by Isabel Wilkerson, Caste, the Origin of Our Discontents. So those are the two things I'd like to do very briefly. I hope it don't take too long. We'll find out sooner than later, I guess. So my book, Memory, Grief, and Agency, starts with asking a big question, right? The big question is, how do we understand structural wrongs today, right? Structural wrongs like racism, sexism, caste-based discrimination in India. How do we understand how structural wrongs operate today? So what I did in my book was to compare two contexts, right? I compared the caste context of India and the context of race and racism in the United States. I compared these two contexts to define structural wrongs today as rituals of humiliation, right? These are rituals of humiliation that continue to humiliate persons from marginalized backgrounds even today, especially when they move out of place, a phrase that you will see throughout my book. And the claim that I make is simply that when people from historically marginalized social locations move out of place, there are structures of society, there are habits of the body that humiliate such persons, right? In my book, I offer four criteria to define what I call rituals of humiliation. One, subjects should feel humiliated by the act, right? That's one criterion. A second is that the action must have a repetitive pattern, right? A third one is that this act has inherited its discriminatory logic from logics of the past, from discriminatory logics of the past. These might be religiously sanctioned logics, they may be culturally sanctioned logics, they may be legally sanctioned logics. They may not have those sanctions today, right? So they may not have religious or cultural or legal sanction today. Nevertheless, they continue to humiliate people based on those logics. That's a third criterion that I offer to define rituals of humiliation. And a fourth criterion that I offer is that if it fulfills this first three criteria, the fourth criterion stands by itself, is that the act of humiliation does not depend on the intention of the aggressor, right? In other words, it is still an act of, it is still a ritual of humiliation, even if the person who is responsible for furthering that act claims that he or she or they did not intend to humiliate a person, right? So those are four criteria of rituals of humiliation that I offer in my book to understand wrongs, to understand structural wrongs as rituals of humiliation. There are two major concerns that inform the work. One major concern is simply this very widespread idea that somehow, with the passage of time, things just become better, right? In other words, just because we are in 2021, somehow things in 2021 are by default better than they were, let's say, in 1956, right? I question that very popular assumption in the book. And that is one of the reasons why I get into great detail in comparing the caste and race contexts to define wrongs as rituals of humiliation, right? The other thing that I noticed very quickly in my work, another thing that informed the work, therefore, is that there is this widespread uneasiness with remembering wrongs of the past. As you'll notice in the title of the book, memory is very important in this work. And one of the claims that I make in the book is that if we actually don't remember the wrongs of the past, we will not be able to understand the wrongs of the present. I did not realize that this claim would be as controversial until I started reading some popular theologians. There's some really big names, even. For instance, two theologians who I engage in my work, critically engage in my work, are Miroslav Volf and Oliver O'Donovan. If you don't know these names, that's okay. But the reason why I pick on these names and engage with them a little bit is because they make a very strong claim. They make the claim that those who remember the wrongs of the past are actually not helping the present moment. And a fear that informs some of these theological claims is that the oppressed, in remembering the wrongs of the past, often become oppressors rather than bringers of healing to the world. I do not accept the claim. As a matter of fact, I reject this claim. And I reject this claim importantly because it's a theological claim. And because I'm a Dalit political theologian, I think rejecting these theological claims are important because it's already widespread outside of the theological world, and it's a bit concerning for me as a theologian that such ideas are also present even within the theological discipline. A third word that I'd like to kind of introduce to us is this other word called grief. And grief is something that all of us know about, and it does a very important work for me in the book, simply because, and you can read the book for more information here, but very briefly, let me say that grief, right? Grief, for me, enables those who grieve over structural wrongs to reject the verdict of loss. In other words, when wrongs are perpetrated, right, griefs enable the one who is grieving, ones who are grieving, a community that is grieving, to reject the verdict of loss and to accept loss. So communities and persons that grieve structural wrongs reject the verdict of the world and reject this very, very forceful idea that somehow wrongs need to be forgotten and we need to move on. And this takes shape in different forms, right? In 2021, for instance, somebody might explain a structural wrong as a consequence of somebody having a bad day, right? Now, grief, what it enables those who grieve to do is to reject that kind of idea and to point to how wrongs today actually operate on the basis of the wrongs of the past. The logics of the past continue to inform the present. If we don't remember that, if we do not grieve over them, then we will not be able to heal the world today, right? That's some of the larger work and assumptions that inform my book. Finally, I talk about how religious communities can intervene in this matter. Religion, irrespective of which religious faith you belong to, will contain rituals, right? There are a lot of rituals that religious people undertake. For instance, Christians, for instance, would undertake rituals like baptism, Eucharist, and so on and so forth. And one of the claims that I make in the book is that unless these rituals are embraced and transformed to be liberatory, they will continue to be complicit in the perpetuation of rituals of humiliation. Any religious community that has rituals as part of its functioning will have to seriously take into account the widespread prevalence of structural wrongs manifested as rituals of humiliation, and will have to take that into account in its own practice of various kinds of rituals, right? Otherwise, we lose that liberatory function of religion that is otherwise just so central. That's a little bit about my book. I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about Isabel Wilkerson's books, Caste, because I am fundamentally convinced that anti-discrimination efforts have to be global today. It's one of the reasons why I compare the caste and race context of India and the United States. And it's one of the reasons why I'm drawn to Isabel Wilkerson's work as well, because Isabel Wilkerson, what she does is she compares three contexts, right? She compares racism in the United States, she compares Nazism in Germany, and she compares casteism in the Indian context. So she brings these three contexts into conversation with one another and uses this this word caste to understand what's going on. Isabel Wilkerson is not the first person to use this framework to understand how discrimination operates globally, but she's doing this in a very fresh way. If you see interviews in which Isabel Wilkerson offers some rationale for why she uses this particular lens, the lens of caste, is because she says, for instance, a concept like racism, when you use the word racism, Isabel Wilkerson will say, people think they already know what you're talking about. And caste allows Isabel Wilkerson to introduce an idea in a fresh way, in a new way, in a way that might enable hearers to understand how discrimination operates globally, right? So the point of connection between my work and Isabel Wilkerson's work is Isabel Wilkerson also uses a phrase that I use a lot in my book. It's not because of my book, but simply because Isabel Wilkerson is very, very smart. She notes how when people move out of place, right? When people move out of place and when they occupy positions of power or just positions in which dominant persons don't expect them to be, they are humiliated. They are punished for stepping out of place. You have to read this book because she offers such moving, paradigm shifting, and even heartbreaking examples. I might mention one just to see just to convey the point. Isabel Wilkerson talks about her own experience in a flight when she boarded first class. Wilkerson boards a flight first class, a first class ticket for which she pays, right? And you know how business class folks are invited to board the flight in the very beginning. So she boards the flight, and the head flight steward there sees her, Isabel Wilkerson, an African American woman, right at the beginning of the line in the flight, waiting to take her seat. And then Isabel Wilkerson has a bad wrist that day and asks for help to put her cabin luggage in the cabin, overhead cabin, and is humiliated for asking for that by this head steward. And when the head steward says, why don't you go on the back, and somebody at the back might be able to help you. And Isabel Wilkerson says, but I'm right here in first class, I need help here. And now the head steward, who is white and young, realizes this, right? Realizes that he has been caught in his act of discrimination. And I won't go into further detail here, but Isabel Wilkerson makes a really, really interesting point that's making me think a lot too, is when the person is caught in their act of discrimination, they take that opportunity not to correct themselves, but to further humiliate the person who calls them out, either intentionally or not. Right. Isabel Wilkerson makes this really fine point, and I think this point is worth considering a lot more in detail, is how persons, when they either call somebody out, when somebody else is discriminating them, whether it is done intentionally or not, they are punished. And that is a ritual of humiliation, right? To use the language of my book. So Isabel Wilkerson does this really, really well. And she offers the metaphor of wind to understand how this operates. I'm going to quote here a sentence from Isabel Wilkerson that I think enables us to understand how racism, how casteism, how discrimination, how structural wrongs operate today as rituals of humiliation, right? Um, Racism, casteism, discrimination. Isabel Wilkerson compares these things to how wind operates, right? She says it's like wind, powerful enough to knock you down, but also invisible as they go about their work. That's how structural wrongs operate today. They're powerful enough to knock somebody down, but also invisible as they go about their work every day. So, part of reading this book, the value in doing that, is for readers to understand actually how racism and casteism and discrimination and sexism and all of these various kinds of structural wrongs operate today. How they are often kind of under the radar and invisible, but actually quite powerful once they are identified and named. The other thing that I'd perhaps leave on the table for our further thinking is, because as an immigrant, I think I'd like to make this point as a final comment. Isabel Wilkerson, again, is not the first person to say this, but she puts it on the table for our consideration. She says that Each new immigrant, when new immigrants enter another geographical location, right? She says we walk into a pre-existing hierarchy, right? And I want to leave this on the table is as an immigrant, as I walk into a pre-existing hierarchy, whether that is in the United States or right now where I am in the Canadian context, is we have a couple of choices. And this actually applies to everybody, whether you're immigrant or not. Is just society is organized such that society enables us to do a little bit of an assessment of how power and hierarchy operates, and then we fit ourselves into these structures, right? I think what Isabel Wilkerson's book offers as both an invitation and a challenge is to think about our own social locations, is to think about how we are constituted by gender, by sex, by ability, by race, by all kinds of these elements that make us who we are, and how we locate ourselves in society based on that. Are we locating ourselves in a way that perpetuates hierarchy and discrimination? Or are we positioning ourselves in ways that actually further freedom and liberation and healing and transformation? That is, I think, one of the big takeaways that I'd like to just put on the table as a theologian who's thinking about, not only simply how the world is, but also as how the world could be and should be. Thanks for listening, you all. I hope you get a chance to read both books and more. And here again, I want to note a point of gratitude for the work of Pan Autumn. Thank you for your work, and thanks for listening.